Hi, everyone. We'll now start. Thank you for being here. There we go. Thank you for waiting patiently as we waited as more attendees, last-minute joiners have come in. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you for joining me. Today we'll be talking about LINQ, all about LINQ. That's what we're here to talk about. The beauty of using LINQ queries, how do we use them in a way that's powerful, intuitive, and useful, and how do we get around the issue of debugging them? Because whenever I talk about LINQ queries, I ask people, do you like to use LINQ queries? And everyone says, yeah, I love using LINQ queries, use them all the time. And then I say, but do you like debugging LINQ queries? And then everybody's hands fall down and there's a silence in the room because it's only the writing of the LINQ queries that we like to perform, right? We don't like dealing with the fact that we wrote LINQ queries and then when they stop working, we have to deal with it and fix it. So, and in my opinion, that is one of the biggest obstacles in C# today, and that's why we created the Ozcode LINQ debugging experience. Essentially, whenever you're using LINQ, in a sense, you're making a sacrifice, right? You're sacrificing debuggability for readability. You get code that's a lot nicer to look at, and it's more readable and more succinct. It's talking at the level of the what we want to accomplish, rather than the nitty and gritty of how we're going to accomplish it, which is, to me, the essence of writing good, clean code. But if I write my LINQ query as my algorithm as a nice big chunky LINQ query, I can read it. It's very succinct. It's very maintainable. It's very beautiful. But if I step over it in a debugger, pretty much it either finished or it threw an exception, but I have no idea what actually happened inside. And what actually happened inside could be quite a lot of very complicated logic, right? That's why we like using LINQ queries, because they allow us to express big ideas in very few short, succinct lines of code. So how do we deal with that in general? So some of you may have noticed that we've created a new blog post on our website recently as a preparation for this blog post, where we've talked about sort of the primitive approach, right? How do we typically do it? The sticks and stones, the roll it your own experiences. So one thing you could do is just look at the results in the Visual Studio Watch window or the immediate window and see the final results, right? That's usually not super helpful because, again, we have a very large chain of data flow, and seeing just the end result doesn't tell you anything about what happened inside. So what people usually do is they try to break it apart, select just a chunk of the LINQ query, put it inside of their watch window, each time taking a smaller and smaller chunk, and try to figure out in their head where exactly did things go wrong. Where in my data flow query did I get the not reference exception or just the faulty transformation? And then some other techniques people might use is to put a breakpoint inside of a lambda expression, and that's been part of the Visual Studio Debugger since 5 or 10 years ago. But the problem with that is that when you step through the different lambdas, you get very, very confused very, very easily, for the simple reason that the order in which the lambdas execute might be a bit confusing at times. And it's very hard to figure out in your head the flow of one particular variable just by stepping through the different lambdas. I personally have never been able to get any real mileage out of that approach. Then the next approach you could do is you could roll your own LINQ debugging solution. And there's been a blog post describing how to do this as far ago as 10 years ago, where you would just write a LINQ query that dumps or logs whatever passes through your LINQ operator. And then at the end, you'll at least get some console output that's very hard to read, but that describes the flow of the query. And then another approach that we didn't even address in this blog post, but is just as relevant, is sometimes you just give up. You give up entirely on debugging your LINQ queries, and you say, okay, the only way I can debug this thing is that if I use a debugger, the normal way of using a debugger, which is to put a breakpoint and hit F10, 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 F10. So they just delete their entire beautiful LINQ query, write it again as a bunch of imperative for each loops, and then they lose all the beauty and the maintainability of their code, but they gain debuggability. So essentially losing software quality in order to appease the debugger in a sense. And that's why, in my opinion, is one of the worst solutions, but you have to do it sometimes. And that's why even ReSharper and Visual Studio now actually support that as a built-in refactoring. But it's very, very painful and very, very tricky to try to debug LINQ queries that way, of course, because you would have the normal problem of having a for each loop and stepping through it manually in the debugger. If you have Ozcode installed with time travel, that becomes a lot easier, but it's still a lot of work. And changing your code to appease the debugger is never a good idea. And now we get to the final approach, the Ozcode LINQ debugger. So let's step into Visual Studio, start off with a quick demo of that, and then we'll dive into more advanced debugging LINQ topics. So I have a beautiful query here. There's a beautiful poem that I wrote, and it's very artistic, as you can see. And I have a LINQ query that's trying to find what is the word that appears most frequently inside of this poem. And as you can see, the Ozcode predictive analysis has kicked in. So even though my breakpoint is up here, Ozcode has already predicted that this assertion is going to fail because we were expecting this LINQ algorithm to return the word code, but it's actually returning the word bugs, but it was actually returning the word code right now, rather. And if I count it in my head, I see that the word bugs appears 1, 2, 3, 4 times, whereas the word code only appears 1, 2, 3 times. So this definitely should have been the word bugs here. And I want to figure out, okay, why did this happen? Now, the whole point of the Ozcode LINQ debugging experience is we wanted to make it so that the more you use LINQ and the more beautiful, more declarative style of C# programming, it will actually become easier to debug instead of harder. So let's see how that actually looks like in practice. So the first thing you'll see here is that as I step down to the actual LINQ query, these numeric indicators show up. And these tell me how many items came from each part of the LINQ query. So for example, we see that the way this LINQ query works is we take my beautiful poem, we split it into words, and we get 79 words out of that. Then we use the where clause to filter out the empty strings. That left us with 29 words, etc., etc. But then, to get into the real magic of the Ozcode LINQ debugging experience, I have to click on one of these annotations. And then I go into what we call a LINQ debugging mode, okay? And LINQ debugging mode is a super powerful way of dealing with LINQ queries because it will actually visualize for you the actual flow of data throughout your LINQ query. So for example, we begin here with 99, which is the first word to come out of this poem here. So 99 came out of split, passed through the where clause, which returned true. That's why it's green. Then we group by the word itself, and then we order by how many times it appeared in the poem. So 99 appears twice, that's 1, and that's 2. That's why this lambda expression here returned the number 2. So we order by the count, and then we take the last one because we want the most frequent word. Now, while I'm inside LINQ debugging mode, I can actually time travel to any item here and see what happened to it. For example, if I time travel to this string empty, I see that the where clause here returned false, and that's why these no entry signs let me know that it didn't continue on to the rest of the LINQ query. I can also explore a particular operator, whatever operator I like. For example, right now I'm looking at the where clause, and I can decide whether I want to see the 79 items that came into where or the 29 items that came out. And of course, while I'm looking at these guys, the red and green indicators on the right-hand side tell me whether the predicate returned true or false for each one of these items. Okay, now we still haven't solved this bug, right? We're gonna need some more information. So I'm gonna go ahead and open up the LINQ analysis window, which I can do by clicking this button right here, this button that looks like a lambda expression. And the LINQ analysis window is a hugely powerful tool because it actually visualizes the flow of the LINQ query as a diagram. So I can actually break down visually what's actually happening here. For example, right now I'm sort of zoomed in on this group by clause. So on the left-hand side, I'm seeing all the items that came into group by, and on the right-hand side, I'm seeing all the groups that came out. This diagram is fully interactive, so I can click pretty much anywhere I want on either side here, and the purple lines will show me what went where. By the way, guys, I forgot to mention in the beginning, but if you have any questions as I go through this presentation, please go ahead and write them in the chat window. I'll try to make this as interactive as possible and answer any question that you write in the chat window as we go through. All right, so the only thing we know about this bug at this point is that it has something to do with the word bugs, right? So I'll go ahead and do a search for the word bugs. I'll hit enter, and then I'll filter the results down. And as soon as I do that, we can see exactly what the issue is, right? I see I've got 3 occurrences of the word bugs going inside of this group, but I've got another occurrence of the word bugs going to a completely different group. So you see I actually have 2 problems here. First, I need to take care of the casing issue, right? I don't care if it's lowercase or uppercase, it's still the same word. And I also need to remove this closing parenthesis at the end. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll hit escape to exit out of LINQ debugging mode. And then I'll go ahead and I'll change the code to reflect the bug fix. And I'm going to do that with the Ozcode live coding. What Ozcode live coding means is that every time I make a change, these annotations will light up to reflect the change. So first thing I'll do here is I'll add, you notice that right now I have 79 items coming out of here. So I'll add the open parentheses and the closing parentheses, these separators that we forgot about. And as soon as I do that, the visualization slides up and tells me, oh, now we've got 81 items coming out of here. But the assertion is still failing, and we still got 19 groups coming out of the group by, because again, the lowercase and the uppercase instances are still going into different groups. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that as well by just saying select I goes to I to lower, and that fixes the query, tells me, immediately that we fixed the query and now everything's all good. Now, another nice thing about the LINQ analysis window is that I can actually now sort of retrace my steps just to make sure that we did fix this bug. So I'm going to go ahead and go and look at the uppercase word bugs that was giving me problems earlier, and then I can retrace it through the LINQ analysis window. So I can go from the source to the where clause, and I see that indeed we got a green checkbox, so it did pass through. Continue on to the select clause I just wrote, so now the uppercase word bugs becomes lowercase word bugs. We go to the group by, and we see that now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, indeed 4 instances going inside of this, inside of one group. Then we go to the order by. And again, the left-hand side is before and the right-hand side is after. So before, this is not sorted, as you can see here, and the right-hand side is sorted. So now, as we expect, the word bugs is the one at the very bottom and is the correct result that is returned by last. So that was a quick overview of LINQ debugging mode. Couple of quick tips. If you Google the words visual LINQ lexicon, you will find this awesome article that a very nice person and a very excellent writer named Michael Sorens wrote. And basically what this article does is it explains all the different LINQ operators, and there's more than 100 LINQ operators. I'm not sure if you're familiar. I myself did not know all of them until I dug through this article. And it actually shows you how each and every LINQ operator behaves based on the Ozcode visualization. So it's a very, very useful way to understand some of the subtleties of how exactly each operator works, what's the difference between to-lookup and to-dictionary, how does select menu works, all these more obscure but extremely useful LINQ operators work and function. There's also this really cool wall chart you can print out and hang on your wall that describes some of the performance characteristics, some of the complexity of each algorithm, the time and space complexity, so looking at the performance of LINQ query. So it's the completely different question whether you're asking about the performance of LINQ queries when you're talking about it from a database perspective or a link to objects perspective, but this wall chart is great at describing the complexity of each one. from a link to objects perspective, so to speak. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the next subject, which is how do I choose whether I want to use the fluent syntax of LINQ or the query of syntax of LINQ. I'm going to open up a quick poll here. So please, when you see the poll light up, which should be now, please choose whether you prefer to use the query syntax of LINQ or the, which is the SQL style syntax, or do you prefer the fluent syntax? Ooh, and the results are in, and it's a crushing defeat for query syntax. So we have 39 people so far, and I'm seeing this update before my eyes. So 42 people right now, 91% of y'all choose fluent syntax, and now, oh, and now it's updating again. So I guess people feel like, you know, they want to be in the in crowds. There's lots of fluctuations in the survey now. Okay, the last results of this LINQ election is 88%, 89% for fluent, and 11% for query syntax, and that's really interesting. So basically, this is pretty much the same results that I get wherever I ask this question, and I have asked this probably 1,000 times now in many different conferences that I go to and I do these demos. And I think that it's really interesting, and I think it's very indicative of the fact that there are very different syntaxes that are applicable and useful in different places. And in my opinion, even though I'm also more in the fluent camp, I tend to prefer to use the fluent syntax more. I tend to say that it's really a matter of the right tool for the job. There are some cases, and this is one that I'm going to present right now as well, where actually I feel like the query syntax is actually much more appropriate. So let's look at an example like that. So I'm gonna show the 90% of the people in the audience that said no, just fluent, that maybe you should reconsider, at least in some cases. So let's look at this algorithm here. What are we doing? So basically, we're trying to find all the best students in the university. So let's first look at the fluent syntax of doing this. So given that I have all the different departments in the university, so we've got math, biology, physics, etc., I'm using the select clause to say, okay, give me the average grade of all the students. And then I'm using select many to say, give me each one, give me their grade. And I want all the students that are above average within that department. So if we compare that to the query syntax, that is much more readable, right? So I'm saying from each department, I'm using let here, which is one of my favorite keywords in the C# language, right? It's very functional, very mathematical. I'm saying let's define a new variable, department average, which is the average grade of all the students within that department. And then from each student in the department, give me just the ones where the student's grade is above average within their own department. And then select out just the names of these good students. Now, I could, as you can see, I could do the same thing in Fluent versus Query. Pretty much everything, almost everything you can do in Fluent you can do in Query, and vice versa. But in cases where I have a more complicated query, where for example, here I'm using two froms, which translates into, which is just like doing a select many in the Fluent syntax. And I'm using the let keyword, which is actually just like using a select with an anonymous type, as I'm doing down here. And that's actually what the compiler is translating the query syntax into anyways behind the scenes. But I think you'll all have to agree that this up here is kind of, it's kind of clunky, it's kind of hard to read, whereas this down here below is actually much more readable, much more succinct. The good news, of course, is that all the Ozcode LINQ debugging stuff will work just the same. So we still get these numeric indicators. We still get the interactivity. So you see that right now we're seeing, we have 11 students that are above average within their department, and I can just change this to show me the below average students, and we have 9 below average students, et cetera, et cetera. And by just clicking on these annotations, we see the visualizations. Now, of course, when I'm looking at this right now, it doesn't tell me too much because nobody bothered to implement toString on the student class. and nobody bothered to implement toString on department either. So this just gives me the default toString implementation. But of course, with Ozcode, this is no biggie. We'll just go ahead and customize the way the debugger is showing me the information. So I'll go ahead and say for the student object, I'm gonna want to see let's say for the department, I'll take the name, like here, and for the student, let's see, what do I want for a student? I'll probably want both their name and their grade. There you go. So very easy, very cool. And now I can actually read through the flow of this query and understand, what's going on. Or I can go through to the where clause. I can see which were the good students, which were the bad students, and then I can, like we saw before, time travel to each one and see what happened. So for example, if we go to Barbara here, you can see that in the mathematics department, the average grade was 44.8. But unfortunately, Barbara was not such a good student this year. She only got a 38. So the where clause returned false, and that's why she wasn't included in the list of good students. Now, just another cool tidbit while we're talking about this, this whole fluent versus query, question, or this rivalry, I would say. I actually want to point out this really cool blog post on the Ozcode website that we did many times ago, because we're debugging guys, we're program software developers, we're very scientific. So we decided to go for a scientific approach to finding out which was the better of the two syntaxes. And what we did is we went crazy, and we actually wrote a tool that sort of harvests GitHub open source repositories, and actually using Roslyn, the C# compiler, we analyzed all of that open source code, and we saw, let's put aside what people tell us that they like to use. Let's see what they're actually using out in practice. So we took a large variety of open source projects. We took Caliburn Micro and Prism and all sorts of things from the old-fashioned WPF world, and we took mocking frameworks, and we took SignalR and Reactive UI and Newtonsoft and various Microsoft-related open source projects. And these are the results. So we see Fluent wins. There are 61% of the open source projects that we analyzed that use only Fluent syntax, not a single query operator. 9% of them use only query and don't use Fluent at all, and 111 actually use both. So this is actually absolute numbers, not percentage. Another very cool thing that we explored, so you can see here, look up your favorite open source projects and see what they use. Another really interesting thing to see here is what are the most popular LINQ queries, and this is really interesting. I actually like to go to the bottom of the list and look at the least used ones and see the more obscure examples that are really interesting, because there's really useful things that may only be useful very rarely, but when you need them, they really come in handy. All right, so that was how do we compare LINQ query versus LINQ Fluent. And now let's talk a little bit about the other LINQ debugging tools at our disposal. So we've talked about Ozcode. We've talked about, the do-it-yourself approach. Another really important and extremely useful tool that I personally love using is LINQpad by Joseph Al-Bahari. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that name right, and I completely apologize. And he's the author of an excellent book called C# in Depth. And he also created this tool. Now, the thing that's really cool about LINQpad is that you can write out LINQ queries, and these could be linked to object SQL queries just to play around, or you can actually connect it to your data source, to your database, and play with that. And then it's just a snippet writer explorer, right? I can write a little code snippet using LINQ. I can hit play, and I can get the results instantly. I can change the code from a toolbar to an upper, for example. Run it again. Boom, get the new results. So it's very interactive, very useful. And you don't get the same level of detail as you do with the Ozcode link debugging experience. And it also doesn't work from within the Visual Studio debugger. I mean, you can get this display in the debugger, but not the actual interactivity. So not really that useful when you're trying to debug, but when you're just trying to prototype and when you're trying to learn. So for me personally, the thing that I love using LINQpad the most for is just learning things. And the way LINQpad enables this is that when you go to the samples toolbar, you see all the different samples, and these include the samples from various books. You can also download other samples online from other books or Pluralsight courses. Sometimes the Pluralsight courses come with LINQpad samples. Then you can just go through the different code snippets, actually execute them, play around with them, and it's a really, really fast and easy way of learning LINQ queries and learning various topics. Like, for example, you can see here that there are samples for what's new in C#7, and if you're the type of person that learns best by example, like I am, that's a great, great tool to use. All right, so that's LINQpad and some more tools. Let's talk now about dealing with entity framework queries. We've had a lot of questions about dealing with entity framework queries. So the first thing I'll say is that all the Ozcode link debugging goodness that I showed you today works just the same when you're using iQueryable. So if you're using LINQ2SQL, LINQ Entity Framework, and all of those guys. Now, the thing you have to keep in mind, though, is that when you're dealing with a database, you might be dealing with a much, much larger amount of data. So let's just pretend, for example, for simplification, that this query here was a link to entity framework query. And let's just pretend that this split up here was instead some database table that had, let's say, 20 million rows. You probably don't want all those 20 million rows being downloaded to your Visual Studio just to get a nice visualization, right? Because that will just cause your Visual Studio to you'll crash, or you'll have to wait too long. You don't want that. So what you can do instead, let's pretend now that, okay, while split is this database table that has 20 million rows, after the where clause, we actually filter it down to something more manageable, like let's say a few tens or hundreds of thousands of rows. What you would want to do then is to simply add a tool list here, so that we turn the iQueryable to an IEnumerable. And what Ozcode does when it recognizes that you've done that, it will only take the part after that we convert it to IEnumerable and show you that. So that's a very quick workaround for when you're dealing with performance issues when trying to diagnose linked entity framework or LINQ2SQL queries that are more slow. Okay, so we'll take now 5 more minutes to look at some of the Ozcode debugging features that are useful in LINQ-like ways, and I'll show you what that means in just a second. So if you have any questions, as I said before, please write them in the chat window, because after I show you this next thing, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. All right, so what happens when I want to use LINQ while I'm actually using the debugger? Like I have a problem that I'm trying to solve in the debugger, wherein I'm working with a large collection, and that collection might have many, many different properties, and it might have some weird structure and nesting, and I want to filter it, or I want to transform it in the way that I typically would with a LINQ query. I want to do that in a very quick and succinct way. So the first thing that I'll show you is the Ozcode conditional search. And this is the exact equivalent of a LINQ where clause, only I can spin one of these off while I'm just debugging here. So I have a customer's collection here, and I've already started the ID and the full name properties, so they're up at the top here. And of course, if you're not familiar, Ozcode lets you customize the way information looks like in the debugger, so I can select whichever property I care about. Like I can select, for example, the full name or whatever field or property I actually care about, and they would bubble up to the top. So whenever I look at a customer object, Ozcode will remember that those are the things I want to see. Now, let's say I want to do a dynamic query here. similar to a LINQ where clause. So I can just say, I want to do a search, but this is not like a regular text-based search that Ozcode does. Like I can search for a customer by text, like Google. Like I can say, give me all the customers that are named Michael. But rather, I want to do a predicate-based search, like a LINQ where clause. So I'll just change this from a text search to a condition-based search. And now I see the special object keyword, which is a special Ozcode thing, which basically just denotes the current object. So I'll say obj.firstname.length is larger than 4, for example. So just give me just the people with a long-ish first name. Or I'll actually make this larger than 6 or larger than 7, so we get some more interesting results. So what you see here is that Ozcode immediately visualizes the results here. It tells me I've got 2 people with really, really long first names. It shows me a red X next to everyone that didn't match the predicate and a green V next to everyone that did match the predicate. And if you look closely at my scroll bar here, you actually see that there's these little green indicators that show me where physically inside of the collection here those items actually are. So very, very useful. And of course, I can filter this down to show me only the items in the collections that actually match the predicate. Okay, next thing. Let's quickly show the custom expressions. And custom expressions are the equivalent of a LINQ select clause that you can do dynamically in the debugger. And this is extremely useful because you might be tempted to stop the debugger and write some codes and add a LINQ query to your code in order to debug in those situations. And what are these situations I'm alluding to? Let's say you're looking at some collection, some sort of data, and you realize that the information that you're looking for is just not there. And you're kind of stuck. I'll show you an example here. So in this example, I'm looking at a list of method info objects that I obtained using .NET Reflection. So basically, all of these objects in this list here basically just represent different methods that we have in .NET. And let's say, in order to understand the bug that I'm currently working on, I really need to know how many parameters does each one of these methods actually have. So naively, what I might do is I might just open one of these, and then I would scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll some more and scroll some more. And unfortunately, there's really nothing here that tells you how many parameters the method has. And to make matters worse, I don't even have the source code to method info, right? I didn't write it. Somebody from Microsoft with a much better American accent than I wrote it many, many years ago. And so it's not like I can go in and change the toString method or add a debugger display attribute to change the way it's presented in the debugger. So pretty much, if I didn't have Ozcode installed, probably the only thing I could really do is just stop the debugger, add a line of code that does a select clause, and then look at it, and again, doing work to appease the debugger, and as if I'm working for the debugger rather than the debugger working for me. So instead, what I'll do is I'll just right-click here, and I'll say Add Custom Expression. Now, a custom expression is a calculation upon this object that I can add dynamically. So again, we see this object keyword, again, denoting the current object, which again is very similar to the first parameter of our Lambda expression in a LINQ query. And now I can say obj, and obj is a method info object, so it has a get parameters method. So object get parameters dot count. And I can give this custom expression a friendly name using the C# comment syntax. So I'll call this param count. I hit enter, and boom, it suddenly looks as though we've got a new property in this object. Of course, it's not really a new property. It's just something that's going to help me debug this thing. So now I can start a custom expression and also start the property as well. And now I've forced the debugger to show me the information the way I want. That's it. So we have gone through all of our content for today, and now we can go into some questions.
Let's start with William, please.
So William Yak says, the biggest thing that I'm interested in is in debugging performance in LINQ, aka seeing how long it took to query the database using where versus include versus single or default. Also, will this work the same when debugging something like an ASP.NET MVC site? So William, thank you for your question. In terms of taking a look at how long database queries took, that is not something that the Ozcode Visual Studio extension can help you with. The Ozcode Visual Studio extension only shows you the amounts of data. We do have a new product coming out that's out of scope for this discussion, but I'll just mention it briefly, that there's a new product called the Ozcode Production Debugger, and which you install on your can install on your ASP.NET MVC applications, and it actually allows you to debug code that's running in production or your staging and QA environments. And one of the features we have there is we actually show you how much time each SQL query took, or each LINQ query took. But that's completely different subject, and there will be a different webinar to discuss that product. So please, watch out for that. Okay, next question. Avruhum Israel Silver asks, how come customer ID had the first name Joseph but showed up when the clause was larger than 4? Did it? I didn't notice that. I think I understand the question. Actually, again, custom expressions will show, rather the predicate conditional search thing will not filter anything down initially. So you will still see everything. So for example, if I say omj.firstname.length larger than 4, you'll still see everybody here. But after, and Jose is included, the red X here is the one that denotes expression is false. So you at first, the predicate shows you everything, doesn't actually do the filtering. It's only after you hit this button right here that Jose or whatever items that didn't match the predicate will disappear. So and you can turn this on and off very quickly. So you can decide if you want to see just the items that match the predicate or both. Hope that clears up that confusion. Next question. Ed Kenny asks, is it possible to tell Ozcode that if the number of items in a collection is larger than X, don't Splunk into it? So I think that question was in the context of the conditional search, if I understand correctly. And the answer is, what you could do in order to do that, Ed, is to just use LINQ within this the custom expression or the conditional search in the context of very large collections. So let's say that I have a customer collection, and each customer has an invoices collection within it. What I would do then is to just do a predicate here on obj.invoices. I could do here .count larger than something, or I could do a where clause and do count on that. So let's say I want all the invoices, but all the customers, but the only ones that have invoices, or let's say have any invoices where the invoice amount is, and I'm just making this up because I don't actually have an invoices collection, so just for the purpose of example, say invoices.total amount larger than 200, whatever it is you want. So you could absolutely do that. Use LINQ query inside the context of using the conditional search to work with very large collections to filter it down and get the results you want. I hope that answers your question there, Ed. Please let me know if you have any more questions. Feel free to write them down in the chat window. While you do that, a couple of wrapping up notes that are very important, very exciting. Black Friday is almost upon us, and there will be a special Ozcode sale for personal licenses. We'll be giving a 50% off discount on Black Friday. So if you don't have Ozcode yet, you should definitely check that out. And I also want to show you a couple more additions to the Ozcode website. So we've added a really cool and useful knowledge base. The knowledge base has lots and lots of links and webinars and videos and recordings. So for example, this webinar that you're seeing right now and lots of other really interesting webinars will be right here. One of the nice things as well is that this can take you over to our GitHub repository, where you can download all the samples, including the Ozcode samples that I showed you today. You can just download that or fork it on GitHub. And we actually also include actual walkthroughs, so you can just play around with yourself and you forgot how to play with the demo. This actually shows you as a walkthrough everything you need to do, what are the different steps, or if you want to show somebody Ozcode, this would be a great tool to do that. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. We've come to the end of this presentation. I really want to say thank you again for joining me today for this very special opportunity. Okay, one last question before we say goodbye. David Redenberg asks, have you considered a version of Ozcode that works with JetBrains Writer? We're actively considering doing that. As I mentioned, right now our focus is the Ozcode production debugger product, which is a very, very exciting product that is extremely useful in many, many different scenarios, and we'll be talking more and more of that as things progress. The product is in beta now and will be released shortly. There was another question to repeat all the different links that we showed today. So don't worry, you'll get an email after this session with the recording, as well as all the different links that I showed today to the visual link lexicon and the GitHub analysis and all the really cool things that we went through today, as well as a coupon code for your Ozcode purchase, if you'd like. So thanks again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.